The empath's pain is not weakness, it is unconscious strength. What looks like fragility on the surface is often the sign of a nervous system that is deeply attuned to the emotional field of others. Empaths do not merely observe emotions, they absorb them, process them, and often carry them within their own inner world. This sensitivity is frequently misunderstood in a culture that glorifies toughness, emotional detachment, and self-interest. As a result, the empath grows up believing that their depth of feeling is a flaw, something that must be hidden, controlled, or hardened against. Over time, this misinterpretation turns a natural gift into a source of shame. Pain becomes the teacher of the empath's unconscious strength. Because they feel more, they are forced into deeper inner dialogue. Where others can numb themselves or distract their way out of discomfort, the empath is often compelled to sit with emotional intensity. This repeated exposure to inner pain builds a quiet resilience, one that does not announce itself through dominance or aggression, but through endurance. The empath learns to survive emotional storms that would overwhelm a less sensitive psyche. In this way, suffering becomes a training ground for inner fortitude, even when the empath does not yet recognize it as such. The unconscious strength of the empath is rooted in their capacity for deep perception. They sense shifts in tone, energy, and unspoken intention. They notice what is avoided, what is suppressed, what is denied. This makes them vulnerable to emotional overload, but it also grants them insight into the hidden layers of human behavior. Their pain often comes from seeing too much, feeling too much, and caring too much in environments that reward indifference. Yet this same pain sharpens their awareness of psychological truth. Over time, they become witnesses to the unseen dynamics that govern relationships, power, and emotional exchange. Many empaths are conditioned early to prioritize the emotional needs of others over their own. They become the listener, the supporter, the one who holds space for everyone else's pain. In doing so, they unconsciously develop emotional stamina. They learn how to remain present in the face of grief, anger, fear, and despair. While this pattern can lead to burnout when boundaries are absent, it also forms the foundation of profound inner strength. The empath psyche becomes familiar with navigating emotional depth, which later becomes an invaluable resource in their own healing journey. What appears as vulnerability is often the echo of unintegrated strength. The empath's pain signals that the sensitivity has not yet been consciously understood or directed. Without awareness, sensitivity feels like a wound. With awareness, it becomes a compass. The same emotional openness that once led to exhaustion can evolve into discernment. The empath begins to recognize that their pain is not random, it is information. It reveals where boundaries are needed, where truth is being violated, where the inner self is being neglected. In this way, pain functions as an inner guide rather than an enemy. The unconscious strength of the empath also lies in their capacity for emotional transformation. They are often the ones who can transmute suffering into meaning. Because they feel deeply, they are more likely to seek understanding, reflection, and inner coherence. Their pain pushes them toward introspection, philosophy, and spiritual inquiry. While others may remain on the surface of life, the empath is drawn inward, compelled to make sense of emotional complexity. This inner journey cultivates depth of character, empathy that is rooted in lived experience, and a nuanced understanding of the human condition. As the empath matures, their pain becomes less about self-sacrifice and more about self-awareness. They begin to see that their sensitivity was never meant to be a burden, but a form of inner intelligence. The strength that was once unconscious starts to emerge into consciousness. They learn to regulate their emotional permeability, choosing when to open and when to protect their inner world. This shift transforms pain into wisdom. The empath no longer collapses under emotional weight, but learns to carry only what is truly theirs. In a world that often rewards emotional numbness, the empath's pain stands as evidence of a different kind of power. It reflects the courage to feel in a culture that avoids feeling, the capacity to remain human in systems that encourage disconnection. This form of strength is quiet, inward, and often unseen. It does not dominate or conquer, it endures, understands, and integrates. The empath's pain reveals the depth of their inner life, the richness of their emotional landscape, and the latent power waiting to be consciously claimed. Overgiving is a shadow pattern that often disguises itself as kindness, loyalty, or moral superiority. On the surface, the overgiver appears selfless, generous, and emotionally available, yet beneath this behavior lies an unconscious motive that is rarely examined. The shadow emerges when a person gives not from fullness, but from an inner deficit. What looks like love becomes a strategy for securing belonging, validation, or safety. The individual learns early that being needed feels like being valued, and so they shape their identity around usefulness rather than authenticity. This pattern usually forms in environments where love was conditional. When care, attention, or approval were inconsistent, the psyche adapted by becoming indispensable. The child learns that to be seen they must perform emotional labor, anticipate needs, and minimize their own. Over time, this coping mechanism solidifies into a personality trait. The adult who overgives often believes they are simply compassionate, yet their generosity is infused with an unspoken fear of abandonment. Giving becomes a way to control outcomes, to reduce the risk of being rejected by making oneself essential to others. The shadow aspect of overgiving reveals itself in resentment, because the giving is not truly free. It carries an unconscious expectation of reciprocity. The overgiver may say they do not expect anything in return, but their emotional system tells a different story. When appreciation is not expressed, when is not returned in equal measure, bitterness begins to accumulate. This resentment is the voice of the shadow, pointing to unmet needs that have been disowned. The individual may oscillate between self-sacrifice and quiet anger, confused by why their generosity does not lead to the closeness they crave. Overgiving also serves as a way to avoid one's own inner emptiness. By constantly focusing on others, the individual does not have to confront their own unmet needs, unresolved wounds, or sense of lack. The external act of helping becomes a distraction from internal pain. In this sense, overgiving functions as a defense mechanism. It creates the illusion of purpose while postponing self-confrontation. The shadow hides in the belief that being needed is the same as being loved, and that usefulness guarantees worth. The pattern is further reinforced by social praise. Cultures often reward selflessness and emotional availability, especially when it comes at personal cost. The overgiver is celebrated for being supportive, dependable, and endlessly accommodating. This external validation strengthens the shadow pattern, making it harder to recognize as a form of self-neglect. The individual internalizes the idea that their value lies in how much they can give, not in who they are. Their sense of self becomes entangled with service, and boundaries begin to feel like betrayal. At a deeper psychological level, overgiving can be an attempt to unconsciously rewrite earlier relational dynamics. The person may be trying to finally receive the love they once lacked by becoming the source of what they needed. They give care in the hope that it will be mirrored back to them. This repetition compulsion keeps them in relationships where their role is to rescue, support, or stabilize others. The shadow remains unacknowledged because the behavior is framed as virtuous. Yet the emotional cost continues to accumulate, often leading to burnout, emotional exhaustion, and a growing sense of invisibility. Bringing this shadow pattern into awareness requires confronting uncomfortable truths. The individual must recognize that not all giving is pure, and that generosity can coexist with unconscious neediness. This does not invalidate genuine compassion, but it calls for discernment. When giving is driven by fear of losing connection, it becomes transactional, even if the transaction is unspoken. The psyche begins to equate love with labor, creating relationships that are imbalanced and emotionally draining. The overgiver may feel indispensable yet unseen, constantly present yet internally depleted. As awareness grows, the individual starts to notice the subtle ways they abandon themselves in order to maintain harmony. They may say yes when they mean no, offer support when they are exhausted, and prioritize others' comfort over their own truth. These small acts of self-erasure accumulate, reinforcing the shadow belief that their needs are less important. The work of integrating this shadow involves reclaiming the right to receive, to rest, and to set limits without guilt. It means disentangling self-worth from self-sacrifice and recognizing that true generosity flows from inner fullness rather than inner lack. Detachment is not coldness, it is consciousness. What is often interpreted as emotional distance is, in many cases, the emergence of awareness. There is a difference between shutting down and stepping back. Coldness is a contraction of the heart, a defensive numbness born from unresolved pain. Conscious detachment, however, arises from clarity. It is the ability to observe without being consumed, to remain present without being entangled. This distinction is subtle, yet it defines the difference between emotional avoidance and emotional mastery. When a person begins to detach consciously, they are not rejecting connection, they are redefining it. They are learning to relate without losing themselves in the emotional currents of others. Many people confuse intensity with intimacy, believing that to care deeply means to suffer deeply. Conscious detachment challenges this belief. It introduces the possibility that one can be compassionate without being self-sacrificial, that one can love without dissolving into the emotional needs of another. This shift often feels uncomfortable at first because it disrupts familiar relational patterns built on enmeshment and over-identification. Detachment becomes necessary when emotional boundaries have been repeatedly violated. The psyche, after prolonged exposure to relational imbalance, begins to seek a healthier orientation. Consciousness emerges in the recognition that not every emotion one feels originates within oneself. The individual starts to differentiate between what is theirs to carry and what belongs to others. This differentiation is an act of self-respect. It signals the maturation of the inner observer, the part of the psyche capable of witnessing experience without being overtaken by it. The development of conscious detachment is often misinterpreted by others as indifference. Those who are accustomed to unlimited access to one's emotional energy may feel abandoned or threatened. They may accuse the individual of becoming distant or uncaring. Yet what has actually occurred is a reorganization of inner priorities. The person is no longer governed by unconscious emotional reactivity. Instead of being pulled into every conflict, every crisis, every emotional wave, they choose when and how to engage. This selective engagement is not a lack of care, but a refinement of care. Detachment also transforms the relationship one has with inner experience. Rather than being overwhelmed by thoughts and feelings, the individual learns to observe them as passing states. Emotions are felt fully, but they are no longer mistaken for the totality of the self. This creates psychological space. In that space, reflection becomes possible. One can respond rather than react, discern rather than absorb. The nervous system gradually learns that presence does not require collapse into intensity. Calm awareness becomes the ground from which authentic response arises. This form of consciousness challenges deeply ingrained conditioning around attachment. Many are taught that love requires constant emotional availability, self-neglect, and the merging of identities. Detachment disrupts this narrative by asserting that connection can coexist with autonomy. The individual begins to see that being emotionally fused with others often perpetuates cycles of dependency and unconscious expectation. Conscious detachment introduces a more mature form of relating, one based on mutual respect rather than emotional entanglement. It allows relationships to breathe, create space for both closeness and individuality. As detachment becomes integrated, the person experiences a shift in how they perceive conflict and emotional turbulence. Situations that once triggered immediate involvement now invite observation. This does not mean apathy. It means that emotional storms are no longer mistaken for personal emergencies. The individual can hold compassion without being swept away by urgency. This steadiness is often mistaken for coldness by those who equate care with constant emotional intensity. In reality, it reflects an increased capacity to remain grounded in the midst of relational complexity. Conscious detachment also deepens self-knowledge. By stepping back from automatic emotional patterns, the individual gains insight into their own triggers, projections, and conditioned responses. They begin to see how past wounds shape present reactions. This awareness fosters responsibility for one's inner world. Instead of blaming others for emotional discomfort, the person becomes curious about the inner mechanisms at play. Detachment thus becomes a tool for inner inquiry, revealing the structures of the psyche that previously operated in the background. Through this process, detachment evolves into a form of inner freedom. The individual is no longer compelled to prove their care through self-neglect or emotional overextension. They can choose presence without compulsion, support without depletion, closeness without self-erasure. Consciousness replaces compulsion, and clarity replaces confusion. The heart remains open, but it is no longer unguarded in ways that lead to harm. This refined way of being in relationship reflects an inner alignment. Entity where awareness guides connection and presence is rooted in choice rather than unconscious obligation. The death of the old self is necessary for the new self to rise. This process is rarely dramatic in outward appearance, yet inwardly it feels like a profound collapse of identity. The old self is composed of learned roles, coping mechanisms, survival strategies, and beliefs that once served a purpose. These structures were formed in response to early environments, emotional needs, and the demands of belonging. Over time, what began as protection becomes confinement. The psyche outgrows the patterns that once kept it safe, and a tension emerges between who one has been and who one is becoming. This inner death is often experienced as confusion. The familiar ways of relating to the world no longer feel authentic, yet the new orientation has not fully taken shape. The individual may feel disconnected from their previous ambitions, relationships, or self-concept. Activities that once brought meaning may now feel empty. This liminal state can be unsettling because identity provides psychological stability. When identity dissolves, the ego experiences it as loss. The mind searches for certainty, for something to hold on to, but the old frameworks no longer fit. This creates a sense of groundlessness that can feel like a personal crisis. The collapse of the old self frequently arises during periods of emotional or existential upheaval. A relationship ends, a belief system fractures, a role loses its meaning, or a long-held narrative about oneself proves inadequate. These moments expose the limitations of previous self-definitions. What once felt solid reveals itself to be deconstructed. The psyche begins to withdraw its energy from outdated identifications. This withdrawal feels like a diminishment of self, as though something essential is being taken away. Yet what is dissolving is not the core of being, but the structures that were mistaken for it. The old self resists its own dissolution. It clings to familiar patterns, even when those patterns cause suffering. This resistance manifests as fear, nostalgia, or a desire to return to what is known. The individual may attempt to revive old roles or relationships, hoping to restore a sense of coherence. However, the psyche has already initiated a process of reorganization. The discomfort of this stage serves a function. It loosens attachment to identities that no longer reflect the deeper truth of one's inner life. The pain is not punishment, but a signal that the transformation is underway. As the old self loses its dominance, a period of inner emptiness can emerge. This emptiness is often misinterpreted as depression or lack of purpose, yet it reflects the clearing of psychological space. The familiar narratives have fallen away, but the new narrative has not yet been articulated. In this space, the individual is confronted with themselves without the usual filters of role and persona. This can feel like a void, yet it is also a field of potential. The psyche is reorganizing around values and meanings that are more aligned with the evolving inner reality. The death of the old self involves grieving what is being left behind. Even maladaptive identities carry emotional attachments. They provided a sense of belonging, predictability, and self-understanding. Letting go of these identities can evoke sadness, regret, and a sense of disorientation. This grief is part of the integration process. It acknowledges that the old self was once necessary, even if it is no longer sufficient. By honoring what was, the individual creates space for what is emerging. This honoring prevents the new self from being built on denial or rejection of past experience. As the psyche moves through this transition, subtle shifts in perception begin to occur. The individual becomes more aware of inner motivations, less driven by external validation, and more attuned to internal values. Choices start to reflect a deeper sense of authenticity rather than habitual conformity. The new self does not appear fully formed, it emerges gradually through small acts of alignment. These acts may include setting boundaries that were previously avoided, speaking truths that were once suppressed, or releasing relationships that no longer resonate with the evolving sense of self. This process of inner death and renewal is cyclical rather than singular. Each stage of psychological development requires the relinquishment of prior forms. The psyche evolves through successive dissolutions and integrations. What remains constant is not the identity itself, but the capacity to adapt, to shed, and to reconstitute meaning. The new self that arises is not a replacement of the old in the simplistic sense, but an expansion that includes the wisdom gained through dissolution. Identity becomes less rigid, more fluid, and more reflective of inner truth rather than external expectation. True compassion begins with boundaries. Without boundaries, compassion easily becomes self-neglect disguised as virtue. Many people are taught to equate kindness with endless availability, emotional openness with unlimited access, and care with personal sacrifice. In this framework, setting limits feels like betrayal, and prioritizing oneself is misinterpreted as selfishness. Yet compassion that lacks boundaries is not sustainable. It drains the individual and subtly distorts relationships by creating imbalance. Healthy compassion recognizes that one cannot genuinely care for others while continually abandoning one's own needs. Boundaries create the conditions under which compassion can remain authentic. They define where one person's responsibility ends and another's begins. Without this distinction, emotional roles become blurred. The individual may take on the emotional burdens of others, attempting to regulate feelings, solve problems, or prevent discomfort that is not theirs to manage. Over time, this leads to exhaustion and resentment. What begins as a desire to help transforms into a sense of obligation. The heart remains open, but the nervous system becomes overwhelmed. Boundaries restore clarity by allowing compassion to flow without the weight of over-responsibility. The absence of boundaries often stems from early relational patterns. When care and acceptance were conditional, the psyche learned to maintain connection through compliance and self-erasure. The individual becomes attuned to others' needs while losing contact with their own. This pattern is reinforced by social narratives that praise self-sacrifice and emotional labor, especially when performed quietly. Compassion becomes performative rather than grounded. The person may pride themselves on being endlessly supportive, yet inwardly feel unseen and depleted. Boundaries challenge this pattern by affirming that one's inner life has equal value. Setting boundaries does not diminish empathy, it refines it. When one is not overwhelmed by others' emotional states, presence becomes more stable. The individual can listen without absorbing, support without rescuing, and care without collapsing into the experience of another. This creates a more balanced relational dynamic. Compassion becomes an offering rather than a compulsion. The quality of attention improves because it is not distorted by fatigue or hidden resentment. Boundaries thus protect the integrity of compassion, allowing it to arise from choice rather than obligation. Boundaries also introduce honesty into relationships. When limits are unclear, unspoken expectations accumulate. The individual may give more than they can sustain, hoping the other will intuitively recognize the cost. When this recognition does not come, disappointment builds. Clear boundaries prevent this silent exchange of unmet expectations. They communicate what is possible and what is not. This transparency fosters trust because it replaces implicit contracts with explicit understanding. Compassion expressed within clear limits is more likely to be received without confusion or dependency. The practice of boundaries requires confronting internalized guilt. Many associate saying no with causing harm. This belief is rooted in the fear that love is conditional and that withdrawal of availability will lead to rejection. Yet boundaries reveal which connections are based on genuine mutuality and which rely on self-sacrifice. When limits are introduced, some relationships adapt and deepen while others dissolve. This differentiation is not a failure of compassion but a refinement of relational truth. Boundaries act as a filter that clarifies where compassion can flow reciprocally and where it has been unconsciously exploited. Compassion without boundaries often leads to subtle forms of control. By overextending care, the individual may unconsciously position themselves as indispensable. This dynamic can create dependency, inhibiting the other person's growth and autonomy. True compassion supports the other's capacity to face their own challenges, rather than shielding them from all discomfort. Boundaries allow space for others to take responsibility for their own emotional processes. This respects their agency and preserves the dignity of both parties. Compassion becomes an invitation to growth rather than a buffer against necessary struggle. As boundaries become integrated, the individual experiences a shift in self-perception. Caring no longer feels like depletion, but like alignment. Energy is directed where it can be given freely, rather than where it is extracted through guilt or obligation. The heart remains open, but it is no longer unguarded. This balance fosters resilience. The individual can remain compassionate in difficult circumstances without being consumed by them. Boundaries create a container within which compassion can be sustained over time, protecting both the giver and the receiver from the erosive effects of emotional overextension